Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 7 where we will be talking about gender in post-colonial studies. Just to give you a background of what post-colonial studies or post-colonial theory talks about. So much of the idea of post-colonial theory, is again very broad and has been used across disciplines in a variety of ways. And so there have been various ways of defining post-colonial theory and post-colonial the idea of post-colonialism. So here what we will be looking at is how has the idea of the post-colonial been engaged with the question of the creation of certain gender relations, the negotiation of certain gender politics in the context of colonialism, in the backdrop of colonialism. And we will be seeing that how several of these negotiations actually create the post-colonial subject. So the relationship between post-colonial theory and gender theory that oftentimes gives rise to what we understand to be the post-colonial subject. And we will look at some of these selected examples of creation of the post-colonial subject in the context of South Asia by looking at some of the significant works that scholars have done over the years. So to start with an understanding here, the political struggles around colonialism, around colonial rule have shown the coloniality of gender and gender order of colonial struggles, and this is precisely what we are going to look at in this discussion, in this lecture. So to give you a background from where does the idea of the post-colonial come from, it is one of the first sources of the idea of post-colonial theory are the waves of feminisms, as you have seen, that the first, second, third ongoing waves, each addressing a different issue, of equality, of rights, of privilege, etc. So that is one of the significant sources of a discussion on post-colonial theory and gender. The next source comes from the decolonial discussions, decolonial ideas and the independence struggles against again the backdrop of colonialism. The struggles for rights and recognition in the diaspora, which is an ongoing negotiation, and the indigenous rights campaigns. So these are some of the significant sources, some of the significant places, platforms where we see the discourse of post-colonialism, the power dynamics, identity politics, etc. play out and shape out various of these gender negotiations. The ideas that emanate from these discussions contributed to the intellectual developments of post-colonialism and gender theory. So we see that Connell in 2015 pointed out that decolonial and political struggles by women in the global South have produced powerful theorizing about the coloniality of gender. So what needs clarification at this point is that we're talking about these categories of people, categories of women, categories of men, geographic areas of the world, yet we're talking in economic terms, for example when we say global South or global North, and although the political aspect of colonialism is really important, it cannot be ignored that the socio-cultural ramifications, the socio-cultural context of colonialism created several power geometries, created several understandings, particularly around gender, and how gender has been at the center of all these endeavors, all these political endeavors cannot be overlooked. And that is where gender plays a very, very important role to understand the colonial dynamics, and how the post-colonial subject is a product of that history. So, we see that there are some converging concerns of post-colonial and gender theory. The first one is a concern to understand and theorize from and challenge the power dynamics of marginality and difference. So, the idea of the margin, the idea of to be on the edge, the idea of to be on the border versus the idea to be in the center, that is a very important, very central concept when we talk about the production of the post-colonial subject. The second point, subjectification of the other and how the subjects of women and post-colonial become known, contained and controlled. So, not just is the the other as a category is created as we see, it is also subjectified, and how the subjects of women, subjects of post-colonial subject, they actually grow out of the discursive formations, they become known, they become controlled out of this, is another concern when we look at the relationship between post-colonial and gender theory. The third concern here is the challenging of epistemological and ontological assumptions surrounding colonial and gender relations across the global north and south. As I said, that although we are talking in terms of the political, the economic struggles, economic ramifications, inequalities, but then when we talk of the colonial idea, the idea of the colonial and the post-colonial, we cannot avoid, or it's rather problematic if we avoid talking about the socio-historical context. So, we were talking about that the idea of the margin is forms increasingly important in this discussion, and we see that the post-colonial gender theories critique the operations of power that create normative claims about the value of masculine Eurocentric knowledge and practices. So, as you can imagine, there are these gendered arrangements that are either presumed or assumed, and they they actually reflect on several of these political negotiations, and one of the assumptions on which much of the ideas of the margin and the center is premised on is the idea of a masculine Eurocentric knowledge and practices as a value system. So, that is one of the reference points that we have to keep in mind in this regard. Now, we have seen that one of the pioneers in this field in post-colonial studies, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, has constantly reminded us, how colonialism was gendered, and here are two ways that she reminds us that if in the context of colonial production the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. And subaltern is a concept we will look at towards the end of this lecture, but at this point I want to make a point, carry on with the discussion that if in the context of the colonial production the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, then the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. So, as we have seen, the idea of the margin becomes increasingly important in this discussion, and we have seen that there are several reference points, keeping in mind that these margins and the core is actually envisioned, is actually assumed, and one of the starting points here is the idea that post-colonial gender theories critique the operations of power that create normative claims about the value of masculine Eurocentric knowledge and practices. So, this is one of the premises on which the margins are drawn, is the value that is attached to the Eurocentric knowledge and practices, and then much of these Eurocentric knowledge and practices often are attached with the label of the masculine label. And we have seen that over time, one of the pioneers in this idea of post-colonial theory, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, has constantly reminded us that not just is the idea of colonialism or the practice or the politics of colonialism gendered, but it is also falling heavy on the category of female, and she says that if in the context of colonial production the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. And subaltern is an idea we will see towards the end of this lecture, but at this point I just want to introduce the idea that not just we are talking about a single margin here. This margin that we are talking about is very nuanced, and there are multiple versions or multiple layers to this margin that we are talking about. And the margins constituted through the gendered post-colonial political economy are silenced center, is how Spivak actually describes the margins. So, the challenge, this series, they challenge the hierarchical binaries of center, margin, self, other, north, south, and male, female. So, we see that this is a discussion that's been ongoing for several decades about the binaries, and not just the existence of the binaries, but also the existence of a hierarchy for these binaries. So, is the center privileged than the margin? Is the north privileged than the south? Is the male privileged than the female? So, all these discussions are around the center and the margin, and not just a descriptive sort of binary, but also an analytical as an analytical category of hierarchy. And we also see that another pioneer in this idea, Chandra Mohanty, talks about the politics of difference and diversity, that the colonial and post-colonial experiences across the world is definitely not universal, it's definitely not the same, and the difference and diversity that we see in this context, they are the result of these political negotiations that went on. So, then what or how do we understand the post-colonial subject? So, who is the post-colonial subject, and how do we understand that post-colonial subject? So, one of the earliest works that we see of the subjectification of the other is by Frantz Fanon, where in Black Skin and White Masks, he talks about how gender is constituted within the colonial subject, and this is one of the earliest works that looks about the creation of the other, the creation of a lesser privileged other in the colonial context. And the subject positions of woman and man are understood as embedded within the colonial project. And with respect to how is it embedded within the colonial project, with relation to gender relations, gendered subject positions, and gendered embodiments. So, it's a multi-layered concept that how we understand this post-colonial subject of the positions of woman and man, and it's embedded within this complex network. So, one lens to understand this creation of the post-colonial subject, or creation of the subject, or creation of the other, or creation of the margin, however you want to look at it, comes from Edward Said's idea of the Orientalism. And the idea of Orientalism is, talking about the mode of discourse for representing the other, and there are various ways the other can be represented, through images, through vocabulary. So it's a discursive formation of the other over and over again, to emphasize that there exists an other who is often less privileged. It is also, the idea of Orientalism is also a style of thought which is based on a distinction between the East and the West, the Orient and the Occident. Again, so it's a style of thought that gets translated to an idea of the geographical difference between the East and the West, or as some scholars have used, Orient and the Occident. And it is also, the idea of Orientalism also functions as a corporate institution and network of vested interests, and we find expressions of that in congresses, universities, foreign service institutes, etc. So the idea, as you can see, it's not just a discursive formation of the margins, of the other, of the lesser privileged, but it is also a way of thinking, a style of thought, and it is also translating itself into tangible actions, such as how institutions or how corporations are built and networked. So it traverses this whole continuum from the intangible to the tangible. So what was the role of Orientalism in defining Europe? So Orientalism, we know for sure defined the other, defined the marginal, the other, the lesser privileged. But what was its role in defining Europe, which was supposedly the center? So what happened is, there were contrasting conceptions of the image, the idea, personality and experience. So a difference can only happen, or a difference can only happen in an effective way when there is a contrast in conceptions. And this is exactly what happened with Orientalism, is that several images, ideas, personalities, experiences, etc. were put forward that were completely in contrast to each other, and that in a way went a long way to define what Europe is, or what being European meant. However, I do want to point out that even this category of being European was taken up by scholars to investigate that even being European, the meaning kept shifting over time, which I will talk about later here. And we also see that these assumed hierarchy of superiority and inferiority. So this idea, this assumed hierarchy became hegemonic, which is Gramsci's idea of the dominant and accepted by consent as conventional wisdom or common sense in Europe. So it is not just again a binary of contrasting conceptions, but it also resulted in a hierarchy which became hegemonic, which became the dominant discourse. So now, how do we understand the colonized as objects to the colonizers? And again, here we see Edward Said's idea that the colonized people are something one judges as in a court of law, something one studies and depicts as in curriculum, something one disciplines as in a school or prison, and something one illustrates as in a zoological manual. So the subject or the category of colonized people were reduced to something that one judges, that one studies, that one depicts, that one disciplines, and that one illustrates. So as you can see, this was all translating into government politics, into the political negotiations of colonialism, and the socio-cultural context is deeply embedded in this negotiation. The Oriental is contained and represented by dominating frameworks, and we have the objects of study of otherness and non-autonomous and non-sovereign. So, all of these acted as signifiers, as descriptors for the colonized objects, the colonized people who became the objects to the colonizers. So, if we look at how the idea of gender and nation played out in this context, particularly for South Asia, particularly the negotiations that went on in South Asia, in colonial South Asia, we see that several trends emerge. So, we see scholarly discussions on trade, colony, nationalism, independence. We see the more socio-cultural aspects of colonialism through nationalism, asking the various women's questions, and then we see a whole trend on gender and nationalism, and we will see how each one of these actually pans out. Also, very important in this context is to understand the idea of modernity or modernities. So, is there single idea of modernity, or are there multiple modernities, and if yes, I mean how do we understand them? So, the idea of modernity grew and spread through processes of colonialism and became integral to the nation state system that emerged. So, it was really a product, it was an idea, it was a way of living, it was a lifestyle choice, it was an economic process, however you want to define modernity. The idea, it actually was born out of the colonial ideas, and then it became integral to the nation state system. So, it became expressed in various ways and within the nation state system. It entails a narrative of progress, a break from an irrational tradition in which subjects always overcome and surpass that which came before. That when we say that something is modern, or we refer to the idea of modernity, it comes with an understanding of progress, of advancement, and which is different from how we understand tradition. And here we need to be careful to understand how we define modernity, how we define tradition, and it is often a politics that is at play which defines tradition and modernity. So, it's always more effective to talk about the politics of tradition or the politics of modernity than just the simple binaries, if at all. And then modernity is put into effect through science and management projects, the development of new social institutions like prisons, hospitals, factories, schools, the new ways of organizing people. So, as societies were evolving at this point of history, so as they were going through colonialism and as they were gaining consciousness to overthrow colonial rule, so all these processes put people through the modernity process, and much of it was put in effect through the application of science and management projects, and which brought with them new ideas of organizing people, new ideas of networking within the society and beyond. So, these are some of the important ways in which modernity can be understood, but this is definitely not an exhaustive way of understanding modernity, but in this context this is going to be important. So, now let us look at some of the key works that have been done in this context, and I start with The Nation and Its Fragments by Partha Chatterjee. So, the we see that this is one of the earliest works that looks at the process of nation building and what were the key characteristics, what were the roles that gender had played in that nation building process. So, we see that the material superiority of the West had to be matched by learning modern science and arts to overthrow the colonial rule. As we just saw that the idea of modernity gets expressed through the application of science, technology, management skills. So, there was a need to match the material superiority of the West in order to overthrow the rule or overthrow the colonial rule of the colonizers. The inner core of the national culture, its spiritual essence, had to be preserved, protected and strengthened, and this is how Chatterjee describes that he's talking about the home world dichotomy. He's talking about the inner and the outer spheres, and one way that the home and the world, these spheres, actually got defined and redefined and negotiated was with an identification of various gender roles. And we see that, as he says, the ideological framework within which nationalism resolved the women's question was this home world dichotomy. That there was a need to build, to have this idea of a nation building through a framework, and this framework was very effectively provided by the home world dichotomy, and much of these the idea of the home world dichotomy was informed or was designed, crafted on the principles of gender roles. So, what he says is there was a new patriarchy of nationalism, a new social responsibility for women. And what was that? It was maintaining cohesiveness of family life and solidarity with the kin group, and it came as an idea of female emancipation, which was associated with the idea of sovereign nationhood, and thus nationalism brought a new and legitimate subordination for the women of the country. So, this is how Partha Chatterjee talks about the in nation and its fragments, that the negotiation, the rearrangements of relationship, the re-networking of relationships between the inner and the outer sphere of the society was heavily done with using gender as a vehicle for that rearrangement. The next key work that was done by Ibn al-Nisin in 1995 looked at the idea of colonial masculinity. So, this work actually engages very significantly, talking about how gender was not just important, but gender was at the center of much of these colonial politics, and she uses the case of the manly Englishman and the effeminate Bengali in the late 19th century. So, empire building was represented as a masculine enterprise, as Sinha points out in her work, that it was the men's job, or it was a masculine enterprise to build an empire, and the gendering of the space of the empire and the activities of empire building as a masculine sphere was related to social and political problems in Europe. So, much of these negotiations actually had to be validated, had to be rechecked in relation to the social political problems in Europe. And in doing that, what Sinha analyzes is the making of the imperial race led to the restoration of manhood, and what led to the restoration of manhood through the athletic activities, scouting movement, adventuring, etc. So, what we see is that at that juncture, at that historical juncture, there was a requirement to differentiate between us and others, the two categories. And the way that the colonizers differentiated the us and others was through using gender. And the Englishmen were labeled, or they thought themselves to be manly, and then the Bengali men, where much of the colonial activities in the eastern part of the country was going on. So it was effeminized, were actually, if we go by the hierarchy and the hegemony discourse, then they were effeminized, and that solved to a large extent the power dynamics, the power dynamics that was required for the colonial rule. So again, you see that gender was not just a significant factor, but it was very, very central to the idea of colonial dynamics in 19th century. The next significant work that we find shedding a lot of important light in this context is Contentious Traditions by Lata Mani, and where Mani talks about the abolition of sati in 1829, which was a founding moment in the history of women in modern India, of course. However, as Mani contends in this work, that we see that these debates around sati were premised on how these ideological positions were arranged. And what we see is what happened around the debates around sati is that increasingly women became emblematic of tradition, and the reworking of tradition is conducted largely through debating their rights in society. So not just now we are moving from just talking about gender being at the core, we are also talking about how do we signify progress of a nation, how do we signify tradition of a nation, and women through these debates around sati, debates around the discourses around sati, women somehow became emblematic of tradition. And Mani very, very carefully points out that the debates evolved to not primarily about women, but about what constitutes authentic cultural tradition. So the premise of sati, the premise of the abolition of sati was taken not to solve the women's question per se, but for an agenda, for a larger agenda of nation building, where women actually took a back seat. And what was more concerning, what was of more significance in those debates were the creation of an authentic cultural tradition, which was seen to be done through the through the emblematic tradition of a woman. So you see that again, this is a key work in this respect, which talks about the role of gender in colonial politics. The next work by Tonika Sharkar, The Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, Community, Religion and Nationalism, looks at again family dynamics, marriage dynamics, and particularly the role of education in this respect in creation of the nation. So we see, as Sarkar points out, that abandonment of liberal reformism by the Bengali middle class in favor of the Hindu cultural nationalism was seen towards this time. And then we also see that there was a resistance to mass education, that the idea of a mass education did not fare well with the existing society. And there were private questions concerning women and the family remain central to public life and to community and nation. So we have seen that now consistently from The Nation and Its Fragments by Chatterjee to Mrinalini Sinha's work on colonial masculinity, to Lata Mani's work, and now in Tonika Sharkar's work, that the questions, the private questions that define the home and the public questions that define the outer sphere of a society, they were constantly being debated. And at this point we see that private questions concerning women and family remain central to public life and to community action. So you see that how much of these colonial politics were actually crafted through the inner sphere, through the the private spheres of society. And the diversity of women's voices and roles that we find in Sarkar's work challenges a single monolithic definition of the Indian woman. So we see that there is a use of a variety of voices brought together in this work, and this questions the idea that is there even possible that there is an idea of a monolithic idea of an Indian woman, because there's so much of diversity and differences and nuances in these voices that practically the idea of a single monolithic definition is not possible or not sought for. The next work that we see in this respect is Anstoller's Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, and this again is a very, very interesting work which looks at the gender negotiations that lay at the center of colonial politics, and particularly, as I was saying previously, that this work interrogates, it questions the cultural categories of European in Europe versus European in colonies. So we see that there were inclusion and exclusion criteria into that category, and much of that inclusion and exclusion criteria required sexual regulations, as Stoller points out, and that conjugal and domestic life of both colonizers and their subjects were in focus. So once more we see that the the focus is on the inner sphere of life. We see that the conjugal and domestic life is in focus here, in order to draw some of these very important political negotiations. We see that in Stoller's work, she has particularly pointed out about concubinage, and concubinage was accepted as a social norm, and as we have talked about that. It was the obvious choice because it was the cheaper way of serving the colonial interest, and there was there was a time when it was probably an accepted fact in the society, but as time progressed, the social mores changed, and there were new challenges with regard to this arrangement, and we see that more and more challenges were faced with regard to the question of possessions over the children which were produced out of such sexual arrangements. And we also see that the social embeddedness of sexuality, what constitutes as morality, of course changes over time, and so a practice that was probably accepted and probably recommended of course changed over time to a deviation from the social norm. So you see that the social embeddedness of sexuality also evolves over time, and Stoller's work is a classic example to show that. And then we have Rachana Majumdar's work on marriage and modernity, which we have talked about briefly in the past lecture, that looks at some of the the role of marriage, or the changing institution of family and marriage with regard to several of these legislations, changes in legislations, particularly the Hindu Succession Act. And one of the central arguments that Majumdar makes here is that challenging the idea that modernizing of families typically is believed to involve transition from an extended to a nuclear structure and from a negotiated marriage to a choice of individual partners. But then Majumdar very effectively challenges this idea in this work and talks about arranged marriages as as an evolving institution and as an indicator of modernity, as an as a process that has evolved over time, and this brings in new understanding of how we understand modernity, the idea of modernization. And we see the role of the Hindu Code Bill, which established the centrality of family that emerged as the propertied subject in immediate post-independence India. So, the Hindu Code Bill for the first time brought the family from the inner sphere of the society to placed it on the national platform, and we see the emergence of the new patriarchy as we talked about before. So, what was the role of the Hindu Code Bill of 55-56 as Majumdar points out, is it was a set of 3 laws which redefined the social boundaries of marriage, family and property matters for India right after independence. And as you can see that through these bills, the marriage, the idea of family marriage, the marriage market is actually brought to the national platform. Marriage was in a way nationalized, and we see that an Indian Hindu marriage with the regional and customary variations for the first time have a legal notion of a Hindu marriage. So, there was a need to have such a legal understanding. There was a social requirement, and I would encourage you to go back to each of these works that we have just discussed and take a deeper look at how gender actually was at the center of many of the significant discussions of colonial politics. So, now drawing from these significant works that we just talked about, let us look at some of the trends, some of the themes that actually come out of these works. So, we see definitely that there is a huge role that gender plays in empire building, and we see that European practice of gendering the colonies as female, use of gender and sexual metaphors to manage relationships with the colonies and the colonized. And a classic work in this respect is one that we have just talked about, Sinha's work on colonial masculinity, that gendering the colonies as female. The next trend that we see is Orientalism, or constructing the Oriental woman as the other of the masculine West. So, again, much of these colonial politics were successful in creating the Oriental woman as the other, and this went a long way in the negotiations within family, within marriage or outside marriage, as we have seen with the colonial rulers. We see the idea of the effeminate native. So, again it just became a given, a fairly easier task for the colonizers if one can reduce, again I am talking about the assumed hierarchy here, to effeminize a particular category of people because of the values, the assumed values that are attached to these categories. And the interracial relationships between European men and native women and European women and native men, were something that became a central point of discussion in this regard, particularly with regard to possession of over children that these negotiations produced. We do see that women had a significant place, or discourse around women had a significant place in empire building. So, women's conditions, as we see, became the index of civilization and the evidence of European superiority and the backwardness of the colonized. So, as I said, as we have seen in Lata Mani's work, that empire building, nation building was a process that was done through using women's conditions, using them as vehicles. So, some scholars have actually asked in this context, when we talk about the index of civilization, should we use descriptors such as developing countries, or should we use descriptors such as previously colonized countries, and that's conceptually very different from each other. We also see that the white women's emigration to the empire was brought with it its own power network with it, and the myth of the destructive female and the white woman's double burden to civilize both the white men and the natives. So, it was not just empire building, but women as a category, women as as an assumed category, had a significant role. So, we see the woman's question in nationalism was seen around two spheres that one is the sphere of materialism, where we have science, technology, rational forms of economic organization, modern methods of statecraft. And then there is a spiritual sphere where self-identity of national culture would itself be threatened if aping the West continues. And much of these two spheres, much of the norms, values around these two spheres continued in the colonial dynamics, using the idea of gender as a vehicle. So, the project and discourse of nationalism looks at nationalism that was not simply about a political struggle for power, as we started this lecture with. It related to the question of the political independence of the nation to virtually every aspect of the material and the spiritual life of the people. And the questions were concerned around whether to accept certain things, whether to reject certain things, or is it desired or not. So, it was very, very subtly intertwined with the material and spiritual life of people. And again, to bring in the idea of social space, as we have seen particularly in Partha Chatterjee's work, the discourse of nationalism, whether its material or spiritual distinction, was condensed into a powerful dichotomy, the outer and the inner. So, we see that the idea of the ghar and the bahir, the how you define your social space, the home and the world, comes in this regard. And the world is the external, the domain of the material. The home represents one's inner spiritual self, one true identity. Again, this is coming from Chatterjee's work, that how you create your domestic social space with regard to the discourse, with regard to the ongoing politics, was very, very central to this discussion. We see that new meanings of the home world dichotomy gave an ideological framework within which nationalism answered the women's question. And we have seen how exactly, or some of the important ways that it was done through some of the scholarly work we have just talked about. And the idea of accepting modernity or making modernity consistent with the nationalist project was on the agenda, and definitely not to dismiss the idea of modernity. So, with that, to end this discussion, I'll leave you with the idea of the subaltern studies, which comes primarily from Gramsci's idea of hegemony. And we see the growth of the subaltern studies group to locate and re-establish a voice or collective agency in post-colonial India, for those who denied access, those who were denied access to representation by colonialism. So increasingly we see that this group of scholars, a subaltern group, emerged to re-establish or give voice, or a collective agency to those who were denied access during colonialism, access to representation during colonialism. And one of the pioneering works again is by Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak?, which argues that the efforts to give collective voice to a subaltern group creates the problem of dependency upon intellectuals to speak for the subaltern condition rather than allowing them to speak for themselves. So Spivak's idea of Can the Subaltern Speak talks in various levels about agency, about the production of discourse, and the role of the subject in this regard. So we see that theories of gender and post-colonialism offer an intersectional and historically nuanced view of social transformations and of political economy of gendered colonial inequality. So we've seen that these works, that we just talked about, they have, although not explicitly, they have yet talked about these intersectional positions of race, gender, nationality, religion, marriage, family, age, etc. And they offer, all of them actually offer a historically nuanced view of social transformation. So all of these works actually talk about these negotiations that were happening with regard to social transformation, during the colonial moment in South Asia, and of political economy of gendered colonial inequalities. So as we see that it's not just a story of political subjugation, it is a much broader story than that, and the socio-cultural history, the the intersectional cultural history where gender played a primary role cannot be overlooked. So I want to leave you with a question that was the colonial project successful in establishing the binary of the spheres as we see it today, if at all, public and private? Why and how? So do you think that having discussed this these works, these scholarly trends and work, do you think that the colonial project was successful in establishing the binary of the public and the private? And do we see it today, if at all, or do we see a different binary today, again, if at all, that is different from that one achieved as a colonial project, and then reason it as to justify it, why and how. If you're interested in further reading, please take a look at Lewis and Mills's Feminist Postcolonial Theory, which is a reader. And in the next lecture, I will take up the issues of gender, family, and marriage. Thank you.